Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Great Decisions Masterclass. Our foreign policy challenge, or great decision today, is tariffs as an instrument of economic and foreign policy. Donald Trump made tariffs a central theme of his 2024 campaign, calling the word the most beautiful in the English language. There's a consistency here. Dating back to the 1980s, Mr. Trump penned op-eds in major newspapers denouncing American trade policy abroad, especially as it relates to Asia.
We are going to be imposing a 25% increase. We're going to bring it from 25% to 50%, the tariffs on steel into the United States of America, which will even further secure the steel industry in the United States. Nobody's going to get around that.
So how exactly do tariffs work? We begin with two countries in a trade relationship. Country A produces a commodity that it seeks to export. It may be very sophisticated, like a computer or automobile. It also could be a natural resource, unfinished product, or a foodstuff. When it arrives at American ports of entry, whether it's Los Angeles, Houston, Miami, or New Jersey, it is halted until a tariff is paid. That tariff, which can vary from one product to another, from one country to another, is deposited in the U.S. Treasury, at which point the product is allowed to continue to arrive on American shelves. Our timeline for tariffs dating back to 1900 shows a great deal of variation. In 1900, tariffs were very high, averaging around 25%. There was a precipitous decline in our tariffs, followed by a rise, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, and then followed by another decline, one that has continued through the 21st century. In 2024, when Mr. Trump was elected, our average tariff was around 3%. The Roaring Twenties are associated with a decline in tariffs in the 1920s, the Great Depression associated with rising tariffs, and then following World War II, the United States began a concerted effort in reducing tariffs across the board, producing a period of historic prosperity not only for the United States, but for countries around the world. 2025, we see a dramatic increase in tariffs. The questions are why? Why now, and towards what end? I begin with a review of the purposes of tariffs, as explained by advocates of the policy. Tariffs give us a way of creating fairness in trade with other countries. We and competitors pay many of the same categories of prices in producing an object. There are wages for workers, taxes applied, things like Social Security and Medicare, and finally there are environmental regulations that increase the cost of producing an object. Our competitors pay many of the same categories, but their wages are much, much lower. Even if their tax rate, Social Security, and environmental regulations are identical, you can see those countries enjoy a trade advantage over the United States. They can produce and sell products in our country for less than we can produce and sell products in their country. But many don't have environmental regulations, or Social Security for that matter, and their taxes are often much lower on businesses. This creates a significant trade disadvantage for the United States. We're not going to be able to sell to them as easily and profitably as they sell to us. Tariffs can level that playing field. Trade deficits, something we've been concerned about for about 45 years now. We had a trade deficit in 1982, but look how it exploded in the decades that followed. We're simply buying more from the world than the world is buying from us, creating a trade imbalance and a deficit. Tariffs can help us to spur domestic production. If foreigners aren't as competitive, we can produce commodities here at home and sell them to the American public and abroad. It encourages a Buy American campaign, producing sales tax revenue, more investment in the United States, and of course with it, more jobs for American citizens. It's a virtuous cycle. We can use tariffs to shape the behavior of other countries, to signal that if they go down this path, it will be at a higher cost. And we can punish target countries who we believe are behaving improperly. Think about, for example, the war between Russia and Ukraine. It began in 2022. The US and the European Union applied very stiff sanctions against Russia, including tariffs. Russia could rely upon China and India for the import of their goods and for the export of Russian energy. So we sanctioned them as well. In 2025, Mr. Trump announced a 50% tariff on China and India because it continued to import Russian oil. So we're using tariffs to shape the behavior of China and India and using them to punish Russia for its illegal invasion of Ukraine. So for all of these reasons, one has to ask the question, why in the world did we ever abandon tariffs? Why didn't we keep them artificially high from 1900 to the present? To answer that question, we look to U.S. foreign policy direction after World War II. We learn lessons between the two world wars, most notably that when America steps back from the world, it becomes less stable, and when countries do not trade with each other, they are more likely to go to war with each other. There was a Great Depression that is often blamed on the tariffs of the 1930s, and World War II is oftentimes attributed to the depression that preceded it.
In the U.S., the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, signed in 1930, was a package of tariffs put on thousands of imported products. It's now blamed for deepening the Great Depression.
It actually happened in the middle of the Great Depression. It did not cause the Great Depression. It was a response to the Great Depression. And the idea behind it was because we had huge unemployment, we were in the middle of the Great Depression, we'd have the Wall Street crash, that this would be a way to try and keep our money domestically.
Trade barriers were raised precipitously and basically blocked imports coming to the United States. It contributed to a decline in economic output and a precipitous drop in employment and the Great Depression.
They were originally trying to protect the farmers, and then other industries said, well, what about me, what about me, what about me?
When the war ended in 1945, our allies were in ruins. The U.S. economy was booming. It gave us the latitude to craft global economic policy.
Back in those days, we were by far the biggest steel makers in the world, and by far the biggest airplane producers, car producers, whatever you wanted to look at. We had half of the world's GDP. I think we thought we were taking and did take a constructive approach by opening our markets to others, but we inspected their markets to be open to us.
Enter John Maynard Keynes, the most influential economist of the 20th century. He argued that mercantilism, the policy we in the world had pursued before the onset of World War II, was both destructive and counterproductive. He devised a plan called the Liberal International Economic Order that would be the blueprint for U.S. and global economics moving forward. Do keep in mind that while liberal means someone in politics who advocates for heavier government hand and usually higher taxes, in economic terms, a liberal is a capitalist. Adam Smith is the father of liberal economics or capitalism. And it is free trade that John Maynard Keynes suggested for the United States as the leader of the global system. This is an interesting economic debate, mercantilist versus capitalist. The mercantilists are called economic nationalists, while capitalists are internationalists who embrace interdependence with other countries. The mercantilist believes strongly in self-reliance, while the capitalist contends that comparative advantage will make everyone rich. Produce what you're most economically efficient at producing and export as much as possible to the world. You then use that revenue, those profits, to import the things you are not creating yourself. To mercantilist, economics and trade, zero-sum games. If the other side wins, by definition, we've lost. But to capitalists, we're playing a mutually beneficial game. Everyone can win if they trade freely with one another. As Ronald Reagan famously quipped, a rising tide lifts all ships. There is a geostrategic dimension to this economic debate. Both mercantilists and capitalists seek the same result: prosperity here at home and peace abroad. The path that they take are drastically different. For mercantilists, you can be prosperous, safe, and secure if you isolate yourself from the rest of the world. For capitalists, it's the exact opposite. Engage the world, trade with them, become prosperous, and through all of that trading, the likelihood of war goes down dramatically. It's not as expensive to go to war with a country you're not trading and investing in or importing commodities from, but it's very expensive to go to war with a country you're deeply dependent upon economically. It's a pendulum that swings between mercantilism or closed trade and capitalism or open trade. In 1930, the pendulum was over here. When the Second World War ended, Smoot-Hawley was blamed for that conflict. We shifted all the way over to free trade, a liberal economic order. Our status in the world since World War II has evolved. If we're simply measuring growth, there's no question we have benefited from this economic model. Capitalism and free trade have made us an extraordinarily wealthy country in the aggregate and on a per capita basis. In terms of relative wealth, the U.S. compared to everyone else, there's an obvious decline. We were largely untouched by World War II economically. It actually spurred our economy. Most of the industrialized world was destroyed by it. So they were very low on the food chain and we were very, very high. We haven't switched places, but the rest of the world has caught up to us. In other words, we're a victim of our own success. We wanted Japan, Korea, Europe, and others to economically prosper and become trading partners with the United States. That's a smashing success. Inside the U.S. economy, it has come at a cost. Our economic system has evolved over time, from basic foodstuffs to light manufacturing, heavy industry, finance, and now fiber optics, artificial intelligence, and robots. In other words, blue-collar jobs have been in steady decline for the last 80 years. At the same time, income inequality has exploded since the 1980s. Here we're a victim of our own policies. My generation, the baby boomers, in positions of power since probably the 1990s, have been drafting laws and regulations, tax codes that benefit us and don't exactly benefit the average American. In fact, recently the Wall Street Journal asked Americans, do you believe in the American dream? Is it still viable to work hard and have a better life than your parents? 70% of Americans said no. The American dream is no more. Young people cannot afford homes. They don't have faith in the evolving economy. They do not believe they'll be better off than their parents. And this is not just going to economically depress people. It's also going to politically depress them. Because if they've concluded it really doesn't matter who I vote for, they're elites and they're just going to protect themselves and their fellow elites, so why bother to participate? It's one of the reasons that the United States since 2016 has seen a declining democracy rating. A longing for the good old days is suddenly very much in, and Donald Trump has ridden that wave. Here he is, a 1%er meeting the average guy saying, I'm on your side. I'm going to bring you and your fellow workers back to the mainstream of America. And it has worked politically. Over the course of the last 15 years, in only a decade's time here, 45% of blue-collar workers voting Republican, up to 57% in 2020, and in 2024, hovering around 56%. So Mr. Trump's rhetoric and his policies, and the Republicans in general before Donald Trump, they have been successful in attracting blue-collar workers. So the pendulum goes from 2016, where we are suddenly going to say no to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, where Mr. Trump is denouncing NAFTA and openly talking about using tariffs to bring jobs back home. That pushed the needle over to the closed trade side towards mercantilism. And today we're seeing the highest tariffs since the 1930s. There are problems with tariffs. First of all, they are inflationary. There's no way around this. When a commodity arrives, it's going to be taxed with a tariff. Now, the manufacturer may absorb the tariffs initially. The retailers in the U.S. may absorb them initially, but at some point, they're going to pass those increased prices, those costs, on to consumers. That means inflation. They will also lead to retaliation. The rest of the world isn't just going to sit back and take it, suddenly paying 15, 25, or 75% tariffs on their exports to the United States. They're going to apply tariffs to our imports into their country. Evasive maneuvers will be found by countries and by corporations. There are ways to avoid the tariffs. There's a manufacturing firm, American-owned by the way, in China, that produces sneakers. Mr. Trump applied a 25% tariff to sneakers. So what does this company do? Does it pull up stakes and relocate to the United States? No, it slightly modifies the design, changes one element in the product so that those sneakers now qualify as slippers. Slippers faces a 5% tariff. So by that one simple move, they're reducing their tariffs from 25% to 5%. Add to that the reality of business. These multinational corporations, Ford, for example, Apple, among so many others, owned by Americans who are invested heavily in China by building industries, they can't just pull up stakes and move to the U.S. They can't spend the billions of dollars that would cost to relocate everyone and everything here. If they do move, they're going to Vietnam or Cambodia, maybe the Philippines. But more than likely, they're just trapped in China. They'll have to figure out a way around the tariffs. It means a lower level of trade in general and very serious supply chain problems. Because if China cannot import critical goods into the U.S. at a profit, it will just send them somewhere else, to Canada, to Mexico, to Europe, or any other consumer market, and suddenly we don't have the products we need on a daily basis. Farmers, more than anyone right now, caught in the gears of this trade war. The tariffs have created a real headache for farmers and present an existential threat to their survival. Farmers worry about inflation, interest rates, and retaliation. All three of them are synonymous with tariffs. When you add to that the fact that soy and corn prices have already collapsed in 2025 at the time of this filming to roughly 50% of what they were before Donald Trump became president, the alarm bells are sounding across rural America. These farms are in threat of going under. And then if the tariffs weren't enough, add to that a very strict migration policy. ICE raids happening across the country, picking up dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of farm workers. Migrants make up over 50% of farm workers in the United States. You take those people off the doles, you have to replace them with Americans who demand more, higher wages, better working conditions, Social Security taxes, Medicare, Medicaid, and suddenly you're looking at more inflation, which will drive up interest rates again. So it's a cycle that does not bode well for American farmers. The problems with the approach in particular, the way Donald Trump has applied tariffs. First of all, the targets. Why are you targeting those particular countries and not others? Why do some countries get a break while others don't? Why do some commodities from Canada, from Mexico or China get to escape tariffs while others face 40 or 50% tariffs? Also, the countries in question. This is a policy that could have been very successful had it been applied narrowly and specifically to our principal economic rival, which is China. China is very vulnerable on the trade issue, and it has reason to be so. It practices unfairly. It provides domestic support that violates international agreements. It dumps products on our market. There are other countries on the sidelines, big economies like in Europe and South Asia, across Africa and Latin America. If we had focused exclusively on China and consistently said what they're doing to us, they're also doing to you. They're dumping in your markets. They're undermining your domestic production. There's a good chance we could have positioned ourselves on the side of those countries and collectively gone after China and forced it to trade more fairly. But we did not do that. Instead, Mr. Trump tariffed basically the whole world. Allies, adversaries, economies large and small. And what he's done is he's driven them towards China. Now they're victims just like China. They're working with China to avoid and respond to American tariffs, leaving us even more isolated and powerless than before. When Mr. Xi of China hosted Mr. Modi and Mr. Putin, China hosting Russia and India, it was a signal that those three will get together, form an alliance to counter American tariffs. The underlying data is highly questionable. On April 1st of 2025, Mr. Trump announced Liberation Day for America, the beginning of high tariffs, and he held up a chart to indicate which countries would suffer and suffer the most. But economists have looked at these numbers and frankly can't make sense of them. We don't know where they came from. There seems to be no consistency. We're not sure what economic calculation led to these numbers. There's been a wholesale lack of consistency. He announces tariffs, gives a specific deadline, and then rescinds the tariffs or extends the deadline. The investors on Wall Street refer to him as taco. Trump always chickens out, something that has not gone over well in the White House for obvious reasons. Changing demands. Sometimes Mr. Trump says this is all about domestic production. At other times, no, it's about political decisions abroad. Brazil faced a 50% tariff when it decided to prosecute a former president of the country, an ally of Mr. Trump. The legality of these tariffs. I think of tariffs as a tax. When I look at the U.S. Constitution, it's abundantly clear only the Congress has the power to tax. An appeals court in August of 2025 ruled 7-4 that almost all of Mr. Trump's tariffs are illegal. They're taxes. Only the Congress can authorize them. That case is on its way to the U.S. Supreme Court. By the time you receive this lecture, that decision will have already been made. Will the Supreme Court view tariffs as a tax and therefore illegal when they come from the White House? Or will they say that there's a line that separates taxes and tariffs and therefore the president can follow through on his tariffs? And as noted in the first lecture, Mr. Trump is approaching lame duck status. By the end of this year, for you 2026, the 2028 campaign will be underway. And so countries far and wide understand there's going to be a new president in the White House, maybe one who will rescind all the tariffs, and so they largely are hunkering down and waiting out Donald Trump. In the big picture, what is this really about? We know there are problems that we have with other countries. They could be economic, social, political, legal. They could be geostrategic. And Mr. Trump is using tariffs to address those problems. On the surface, I understand that. At times, I even support it. The U.S. should punish countries that misbehave, whether it's in their trade relations with us or in their actions towards neighboring countries. But as I think about Donald Trump, his view of the world and America's place within it, I see tariffs as something driven by a larger policy and a more central concern, which is migration. Mr. Trump wants to deport large numbers of people who are not here legally. Perfectly fine. You must be legal to be in the United States. If you're undocumented, you should not take American jobs. If we don't have Americans to fill those roles, then Congress should act to create provisions allowing people from abroad to enter the U.S., fill those roles for a period of time, and then depart when their services are no longer necessary. Mr. Trump seems to view this in a much larger context. He wants fewer foreigners in this country. And if there's one thing that correlates very clearly and closely with immigration, it is trade. When you trade with a country over time, that trade rises and falls for a variety of reasons. That very closely aligns with the number of their people living in your country and your people living in theirs. If you trade with a country, they're going to live in your country. If you don't trade with a country, they're not. And so by shutting down trade with other countries, Mr. Trump is directly affecting the number of foreigners who enter the United States. When the Second World War ended 80 years ago, the United States established very strong ties and relationships with countries abroad. They were economic, political, geostrategic, and military. Those ties created a global order with the United States at the center, with the United States at the top of the food chain, the most influential country without question. Mr. Trump is weakening so many of those ties that produced democracy abroad, prosperity, and general levels of stability, the likes of which modern history has never seen. And as he does so, through a trade policy, through a unilateral policy in foreign affairs, and through America First, he is intentionally weakening many of those ties. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is a very different thing. It is a different world that is evolving as a result of this redirection of America from global engager and defender of principles to a country looking more inward upon itself and using tariffs to reduce trade reliance on other nations. Thank you for attending this lecture, and as always, stay engaged and make great decisions.
Thank you for your support and for your participation.